Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us together today. I ask that the technology would all work and that you would be with our presenter, that everything would go well, and that we would learn a lot and that we'd be able to ask good questions and good interaction. Thank you as well, Lord, for all that you do for us and for the lunch that some of us are eating. May we rejoice in you and all that we do. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, all yours.
Great. Thank you. So I'm sure that you will let me know if you can't hear me at some point, if something goes wrong. I am on the outer end of finishing a cold or something, but I have cough drops and water. So I hope you can hear my voice okay. I understand we need to finish at 11:20, if that's correct. So
yes, your time, 11:20.
Yes,
correct.
Thank you. Right.
That's done with Q&A.
Okay, yes. So this is a further refinement rendition of a couple of talks that I've given before, generously supported by SIL, and also work that I've been working on forever as part of a dictionary and grammar writing project and so on. So it's something that has kind of niggled at me for a while. And let me see if I can get my screen to work here. Yes. So I first of all want to acknowledge many people who have contributed to this research across the years, many different Maasai speakers or Ma speakers. Ma is the word that they use for the name of the language. And also many funders, including or support in various ways, including Africa International University in Nairobi. So let me just proceed and hope my voice holds out. So some background on this question that I want to try to, or set of questions that I want to try to address today. In 1955, Archibald Tucker and John Mpaayei's grammar, 1955 grammar of Maasai, they have several sections on what they call neuter verbs. And at first I sort of scratched my head and said, what in the world do they mean? And as a linguist who worked on other languages and in my training and so on, I don't think I had ever heard of anything like a middle verb. Well, yeah, I kind of heard something about Greek, but I didn't know what it was. Just to clarify that when they said neuter, they did not mean something like grammatical gender, like what you find in, say, German, where you have masculine, feminine, and so-called neuter nouns. It's something on the verb and relates more to clause structure. So I imagine that some of you are familiar with Spanish and other Romance languages or Slavic and so on. And just to kind of bring us into the ballpark of what we're talking about, there's this sort of mystery of Spanish so-called dative pronouns. If you have a simple transitive clause like cortó el árbol, he or she cut the tree, if you wanted to pronominalize the object, you would say lo cortó, where lo refers to the tree or whatever the object is. But there's an alternative way that you can construct a sentence with this verb, something like se cortó, which then means he or she cut him or herself, right? Now here we have pronoun things, but they kind of circulate around the verb. We also have sentences in Spanish like fue al bosque, he or she went to the forest, and you can also say se fue al bosque. And for the longest time, and including until today, not only I, but native Spanish speakers, including those who are trained linguists, say, there's no difference between fue al bosque and se fue al bosque. Now, people have written dissertations on this topic, and so maybe there is some difference, and I don't really want to get into the Spanish situation here. But the point is that sometimes it's really clear what se is doing or meaning, and other times it's much less clear. So this is kind of my questions of, what in the world is this so-called se thing? Again, I'm not going to be talking about Spanish. And what in the world did Tucker and Mpaayei mean by neuter, and so on? Well, somewhere along the lines, I thought to myself, maybe it has to do with middle. So that made me start to try to figure out what in the world middle means. So the goals for today are to address certain, let me call them frozen verb forms in Ma, and try to argue that these are what are called media tantum, a Latin term, but that's used to refer to certain ancient Greek and so on forms. What that means is middle only. So verbs that occur only in the middle form. And then you might say, well, why do you call it a middle form if that's the only way they can occur? We'll look at this from the perspective of giving a very high-level, fast overview of some morphophonology and semantics, and briefly touch on some syntax points, and compare these frozen forms with what are called oppositional middle forms. Address or raise the question of whether the Ma situation is typologically unusual. And here I'm hoping that the ancient Greek experts in the room will have something to say. We'll look at the semantic profile of the Ma media tantum verbs. And if we have time, briefly look at irregularities in the Ma middle system and raise questions about how those irregularities might arise. The study is based on looking in detail at over 400 Southern Kenyan Ma verbs, which I would say initially appeared to be middles to me, collected across many years from native speakers and working on a dictionary and so on. Okay, so let's start with a brief characterization of what the middle is from a semantic perspective, first of all. So in 1968, John Lyons said that the middle is a construction where the action or state affects the subject of the verb or his interests. The bolding is mine here. Okay, it's a semantic kind of a definition. In 1993, Suzanne Kemmer wrote or published a book that was a revision of her dissertation. It's been very influential, where she described the middle as involving situation types with a low degree of elaboration. And what she means by that is a low conceptual differentiation between an initiator and an endpoint. So if you think of two participants and one acting on the other, and you can see that they're different, not the same individual at all, you have a very distinct, a situation with a very distinct initiator versus endpoint. But if you think of this kind of situation in the red box here, the participant is perhaps, you might say, acting on themselves. And in that case, the initiator and the endpoint are not so distinct. And so this one here, of course, is what we would call a reflexive situation. And Kemmer identified or argued that the reflexive was sort of the heart of what a middle means, sort of like in the Spanish situation, se cortó, he or she cut themselves. In much more recent work, Inglese, looking at a lot of different works, typological study of over 129 languages, I think, and where people talked about the middle in X language or languages, he concludes, the greatest obstacle in the typological study of the middle is that there is no agreement on what cross-linguistically counts as a middle marker. And his conclusion is that the middle is a cluster of semantic functions related to valence reduction. And again, this is my bolding here. Okay, so he says, it's not the reflexive, the definitions of Lyons and Kemmer and so on don't correlate too well with what people are calling middle in different languages. Okay, so to give an idea of what he meant by the cluster of semantic functions, here's some data from Italian, of course, related to the Spanish se construction. And this is just one of his lists of verbs. And when you see these in the caps here, the different kinds of situation types, I'm talking about the semantics of them. To shave oneself is like a grooming or reflexive sorts of situation. Stand up, change in body posture, non-translational motion, where like something like turn or spin around, translational motion, move, emotion, get angry, cognition, to envisage or imagine, for something to melt, like the ice melted, spontaneous, or what some people might call anticausative, or sometimes maybe not spontaneous, but often, if it's just only, the ice melted. Fight, where you have to have two participants, but they're both, or at least two, but they're interacting on each other. To hit yourself, to one goes, or like houses are sold here, those kinds of impersonal situations where it's not really clear who's doing it. Passive, but again, speaking of this semantically, so is sold, if something is sold, presumably it can't sell itself. Well, we could debate this, but anyway, Inglese would call this a semantic kind of passive. Facilitative, something like is easily cut. So you can see that this C form occurs with all of these different kinds of semantic situations. And so that's what he means by a cluster. He goes on, however, to say, you can't really just deal with, come up with a nice semantic definition. And so in looking at this typologically, he says that a middle construction has three characteristics. And I really refer you to his writings on this because it's a fairly complex definition, and I'm only going to touch some of the high spots here. He says it has three characteristics. One is that it's a construction that codes one or more valency reducing semantic operations, or valency reducing operations: passive, reflexive, reciprocal, anti-passive, anticausative. It doesn't have to, in some language, cover all of those, but it will cover some of them. And there's various reasons why that I put or suggested in italics here, why he adds this to his definition. I again refer you to his writings for the full explanation of this. The second characteristic is, he says it's obligatorily lexicalized with some intransitive stems. In other words, you have to have it. You can't not use it with that root or that stem. And this is what is then called a media tantum, or a middle only form. And I still scratch my head despite his voluminous discussions of this and say, why is this included? But it's partly because he's trying to look across many different languages and say, what is it that people are calling a middle in these different languages? And he has, thirdly, some other semantic criteria that I won't get into in too much detail here. Okay. Importantly, I think he says, hey, all of these features occur with what's called the middle in ancient Greek. Very fortuitous, because after all, if you came up with a definition of middle that didn't account for ancient Greek, you'd be kind of choose some other term rather than middle, right? But he says, therefore, ancient Greek has a middle system because it has all these properties. Okay, now another point here is that he draws out is the difference between an oppositional middle, or some people use the term alternating middle, versus a media tantum. So what does he mean, or what is meant by that in the literature? So if we look at ancient Greek, and pardon my pronunciation of anything here, we have this suffix more or less like omai with various allomorphs, and it can occur with verbs that alternate between the middle and the active or non-middle form. And in doing so, when you get this alternation, you see a valence change. So in the examples in 2, you see dio, to burn something, as an action, a transitive action, versus diomai, to burn by itself, as an intransitive. And so since you have both of these forms with the same root, this is an opposition or an alternation. But you also find this same ending or allomorphs of it on verbs that only occur as middles. You don't ever find the alternation. So with verbs like to sit, to move intransitively, to be angry at, to fight, they just always have the middle ending. So these are the media tantum forms. And both of those kinds of situations are found. Okay. In looking at oppositional middles across 129 different languages and doing a rather sophisticated kind of statistical analysis, multidimensional scaling, he finds that at least in these languages across these languages that he's looked at, that anticausative, in other words, where there's no idea of a causer, but just thinking about the semantics of it, or the pragmatic situation, you might think that there could be or should be a causer. He says that that is the most common kind of situation he finds described. So that's why the anticausative here is in the center of this diagram. And every other kind of situation or situational arrangement, if connects to that. So for example, if you have a language where this form, whatever it is, this construction expresses self-benefactive or do something for yourself, it will also express the anticausative. But you don't find necessarily that every language that uses whatever this construction is for a facilitative will also use it for self-benefactive. So it's sort of like the anticausative connects everything. The reciprocal is really common, the reflexive is really common, but he doesn't find that it's the center of the cluster the way that Kemmer tried to argue for this. When we look at the Ma data, and I would argue a little bit against some of Inglese's conclusions about Maasai, but I would say that the types of situations underlined in red are the ones that this middle construction codes. That you don't find it being used for passive. In fact, the language doesn't really have a passive. You use another construction for self-benefactive, another one for anti-passive, another one for impersonal, and so on. So clearly this construction that we're going to look at in Ma kind of sits in a network related to other constructions that code part of this semantic cluster. And that's a language-specific fact. Okay, so some background on Ma. It's an Eastern Nilotic language, sometimes referred to as Maasai, spoken in Kenya and Tanzania. Tons of morphology, highly morphological language. The grammatical aspect, the unmarked verb form, let's call it a non-perfect. It's a marked perfective or perfect marked progressive. I think I know the difference between perfect and perfected, but you use a single form to code that whole range. Itive, inventive, directionals or associated motion forms. Lots of valence-related operations that you mark on the verb. So there's at least two different applicatives, but they code a range of semantics. One is traditionally called the dative, even though it's a verb affix, and the instrument. There's causative, there's at least two major verb classes and some minor classes. I won't get into that too much today, but you get different causative forms for those. In terms of valence reduction, which is concerned with our middle problem, you get an impersonal. This is what people might refer to as a non-promotional passive kind of situation. I won't get into the details of this too much, except that if you have an impersonal, your single argument will be encoded like an object. In other words, you don't promote that argument to have subject properties. And then there's the middle, and it contrasts with the impersonal because the single argument occurs in the nominative case. So this is more like a promotional, you might argue, promotional situations for those situations where your single argument is a patient. Okay, so that's just a bit of background about some of the morphology you find on verbs. Looking specifically at the Ma, middle, tons of allomorphs, partly because of tone, sandhi, partly because of vowel harmony, partly because of consonants coming and going, and partly because of historical collapse with other morphemes. I'm just putting this slide up here so that you don't freak out, hopefully, if you see slightly different forms or seemingly radically different forms of what I will call the middle. But these all have middle elements in them. Okay, so let's look at the Ma middle, some examples, and we'll look at some oppositional ones first. So here we have a simple verb form, adung, meaning to cut something. This is a language where transitivity is highly lexicalized at the root level. In other words, your verb roots are either transitive or they're intransitive. And this is a transitive root. So without any object overtly marked in the sentence, you know that there's an agent and a patient and they're distinct participants. If you put the middle suffix on this verb, you get a whole range of meanings, and immediately you see this cluster, semantic cluster kind of issue coming up. So this verb adungo can mean to become separated or cut, so that's like the anticausative meaning or resultant state. It can mean to cut yourself or divide yourself into groups or something, the group of cows divided themselves up. To be interrupted or to cease or to have a disrupted flow or to just stop in the flow of something. So referring to electricity or water flowing or cows coming from heaven or your heart beating and so on. It can have spontaneous kinds of meanings, so like to stop giving birth in the sense of to be past menopause, or to dry up of like a spring of water, something like that. So there's this whole range of different kinds of situation types that, depending on the context, might be understood just by this little simple verb form here. Okay, if something about the verb form or the clause is plural, then you get reciprocal meaning, so to cut each other or to be divided up into portions of something that is somehow plural or collective. Okay, so this is an oppositional middle because you get both the simple transitive and you get the middle form with that root. Often with oppositional middles, you get predictable meaning in the middle form. So here's a verb form, anyinyiru, meaning to let out tiny amounts of liquid. And here we have the ventive directional on the end of the verb marked in red. If you form the middle of this, you get anyinyiru, meaning to be let out or exuded in tiny amounts, where we get the anticausative, so-called passive or spontaneous kind of meaning. Well, this is completely quite predictable, that meaning change when you add the middle. But sometimes the semantic changes are quite, I would say, from a synchronic perspective, much more unpredictable, involving metaphor, metonymy, but sometimes the link can be kind of lost. So aibung has a whole range of meanings: to catch, arrest, rape, stick to following a path, touch, become. Turn it into the middle, to coagulate, of something like blood or milk, plus other possible senses. And it's quite lexicalized, meaning that's coagulation. The verb root asip means to strip something completely bare, to make it utterly clean. So with this verb root, for example, asip, you could not clean a plate with a spoon. You'd have to use your tongue to make it something like a sip. Turn it into the middle form, and it means to be true, plus some other senses. So these, I would say, much more unpredictable, at least synchronically. Okay, with that background on oppositional middles, let's look at the Ma style media tantum. How are things going? Can people follow my voice here? Okay, all right, good, thank you. So in citation form, which is, let's call it the simplest infinitive form, not marked for person or anything else, or the simplest person inflected form, so replacing the infinitive with a person marker for subject, typically. The media tantum verbs always look like they have a middle ending, one of those many different affixes that I showed on that middle slide of all the different allomorphs and combinations. And I would say that this looks like a middle, both because of its phonological form, but also the same range of allomorphy and aspect forms as the oppositional middles have. Okay, so there's some morphology reasons and alternation reasons, but always having something that looks like a middle on it. And that the media tantum verbs, they fall into groups that fit with the semantic range of functions that the oppositional middles have. So both semantically and in their allomorphy, you might say, they look like middles. But you've always got to have a middle affix on there, or a middle something that maybe you even want to say it's not an affix, can you take it off or not? Okay, so let's look at an example. The verb amera, meaning to be drunk or intoxicated. There is no synchronic verb like amer. Everybody says, no, that's not a word. It's not a word of ma. Doesn't make any sense at all. But Rainer Vossen, in his 1982 reconstruction work on Eastern Nilotic, he reconstructed a form, and here my asterisk means a reconstructed form, and showed this dash-like thing here on the end of his reconstruction for a stage prior to modern Ma. And the reason he did was because as he looked across the different Eastern Nilotic languages, every single one of them that he found looked like they had a middle appearing ending or suffix, or a suffix. He didn't call it a middle, but a suffix that kind of looked like this, or one of the allomorphs. And in particular here, his Ongamo form that he found attested or collected himself, I'm not sure, had this verb form atemere, where this e form is one of the allomorphs of the middle on that preceding slide. And this whole verb form corresponds to or looks exactly like a Maasai singular perfective middle of a class 1 root. I apologize for that mouthful of stuff, and I'm not really showing you all these class 1 roots, but this te form here and the e on the end, it looks like that form, but you notice that it's not mera, it's mere here. So you see this alternation across the family between forms meaning to be drunk that have a on the end, that have e on the end, and he says, you've got to reconstruct an ending there because they all have it. That's the way you say be drunk. Okay, so in other words, alternation in Eastern Nilotic between final a and a on cognates of be drunk argues that the final a that you see in the ma form must historically be something you could have picked off. In particular, the non-perfect perfective middle affix reconstructed perhaps as ar. And it also argues that mera is not historically a basic stative root that just coincidentally happens to end in a. Okay, that must have been an old affix because of the alternations you see across the family. Okay, so in citation form, the media tantum forms always look like they have what should be a middle ending. And these are reminiscent of ancient Greek media tantum verbs. So I think if we're going to talk typologically, terminology, this makes sense to use that term. But what is perhaps weird about them, and this is where I seek your input too, these forms in ma, despite everything I have just said, they can drop the middle ending when they carry certain other core affixes. Now you say, okay, what do you mean by core affix? This is my term for a whole set of affixes that behave in a certain certain set of, well, let's say they replace the middle. Okay, so, but these verbs, these media tantum verbs, they either have to have the middle ending or they have to have one of these other core affixes, but they cannot occur in what looks like it ought to be the simple root form. They have to have one of these set of affixes. Okay, so you ask somebody, how do you say this word, like be drunk, and they'll give you the form that looks like the middle ending, or that has the middle ending, and that's the right form to put in a dictionary as, you know, a word form you're going to look up for that concept. But when you really explore the language, you find sometimes that ending has disappeared, but there's always some other affix. You cannot get the simple root form. It's not like adum, to cut. Okay. I found one other language, actually pointed out by Inglese, that looks similar to this, Yuracare in Bolivia, where you put on a causative affix into the construction, then the middle ending disappears. Okay, but I don't know of any others here. So back to what are the core affixes, I'll just list them here. All the middle forms are part of this set. The progressive aspect form, the anti-passive, if you get either the progressive or the anti-passive, you cannot get a middle form. The itive-inventive, there are other non-media tantum verbs that will combine the itive-ventive directionals and middles. The instrument suffix, dative applicatives, and the causatives. Okay. Notice that some of those are suffixes, most of them, one of them is a prefix. The middle endings are suffixes. You cannot combine this class 1 causative prefix with a middle ending, not even on the media tantum verbs or the verbs which otherwise are media tantum. So let's take a brief example here. We have this verb mera, meaning to be drunk. Here's this sentence: they take drugs that intoxicate. And we have the anti-passive ending on this verb, and the has disappeared. Now, I would suggest here that we actually have a causative stem in here, and that the anti-passive is occurring on that causative stem. But you notice that the is gone here. That's the important thing. And up here, I said that you cannot combine the middle with the causative prefix. So what is it that's really causing that that's triggering that to disappear is a kind of an open question when you just look at this example here. But notice that the is not there. Now the anti-passive begins with a vowel, so you might ask, well, is that disappearing from mera just because of some phonological problem that you cannot get vowel clusters? Well, the answer is no. So Ma has no prohibition at all on vowel clusters. We've documented at least 42 different combinations, two different vowel qualities coming right up next to each other within a single mora, actually, and across moras as well. And also you can sometimes, depending on the conditions, insert epenthetic glides to break up vowel sequences, but you don't find that here in the cause to be drunk or intoxicate sense. And crucially, we find that a class 1 causative prefix can cause the final vowel to disappear from a media tantum verb. So here we have a media tantum verb, anuta, to be pregnant. You cannot say anut. But if you put the causative prefix on there, aitunut, all of a sudden the causative, that ending vowel disappears, meaning to impregnate a person. Okay, so it cannot be just to resolve a vowel cluster problem that it disappears. This does not happen to all roots that end in vowels. So we have this other root, do, which means to be long or to be tall, so to be extended in a roughly linear way. You put the causative prefix on that, meaning to make something be tall or long, and the final vowel does not disappear. So this ado, odo, is just idiosyncratically happens to end in a vowel. Okay, it's not like the media tantum verbs. So question, why do media tantum forms ever come to exist? Why should there be verb forms that have frozen or middle endings you can't take off, and you want to think of them just, hey, that's the way the word is? So I think synchronically, this is what Ma speakers think about these verbs. They just end in an and you better put there, or an o, depending on the vowel harmony. You better put it there, or you don't have a proper word. You don't have a recognizable word. Is it due to semantics, frequency, something else? Well, we looked at this sample of 402 verbs pulled out of our lexicography materials. Middle form verbs. This included oppositional middles that happen to have been included in the dictionary, included because they're so high frequency in form, or because their semantics are kind of irregular. So like the asip, to clean something completely, utterly clean, versus asipa, to be true. We would put both of those forms in the dictionary. But we didn't go and create a whole bunch of other oppositional middles that we could have easily done, because it's quite a productive process. So we just looked at these 402 that came out of the dictionary materials. Okay, now I hope you don't freak out at this table. this is some of the statistics, the numbers that went into trying to figure out what's going on semantically with these forms. So we looked at oppositional middles in these 402 things versus the media tantum ones, the ones where you can't take off the ending, and charted them by the kind of semantic situation that was coded. Now you notice that this 402 is smaller than this total 426 down here. And that's because a single form, let's call it a lexeme, maybe, it's in the dictionary, they can have multiple senses. So you might find some verb that can have one meaning that's spontaneous and another meaning that is some sort of, human propensity, something like that. So just briefly, these abbreviations: motion, non-translational, so that's something like to spin around; spontaneous, sort of like melt; state or resultant state. So to be true, for example, would be a state. A resultant state would be something like to be broken, so on. Facilitative state, so easily broken, something like that. Non-human process, something like to melt, or many of these processes, they sometimes can apply to humans as well as non-humans, but some of them are more typically, you don't usually find people melting. And then ones that relate to humans more typically, so the body state, like to be sitting, to be lying down, so on. Body posture, a body state, that would be something more like to be hot, to be angry, perhaps. I'm sorry, these are getting into some of these others. I mean, okay, the dividing line between these is not always clear either. Is to be angry more of a body process or a cognition emotion, for example? Human propensity, so somebody who is typically angry, somebody who is typically jealous, somebody who is typically sad. There, you can see the degree kind of thing here. And then human behavior that is not sort of emotion, cognition, one of these other things here. So we tried to chart the different senses or uses according to these categories, and then to compare the ones that are typically less human to those that are typically human in terms of the senses, and do some statistics on it. And we find that there is a statistically significant difference between how the oppositional middle forms, the middles that are derived from result from the ones where you can get the simple transitive form, versus the media tantum forms. Now, to get a more easily apprehendable look at this, here's this same data, but put into a couple of bar charts here. Over here, we have the oppositional middles, and here we have the media tantum ones. The human related ones are in the brown color, the non-human related or less human related are in the gray color. And the difference in how these two are related here, you see there's more non-human related other ones, senses for the oppositional middles, and the ratio or the kind of skewing that you see is the opposite for the media tantum. In other words, of the media tantum, many more of them, is it much more, many more, are human related compared to the non-human related ones. So the skewing goes in opposite directions for these two groups, which I think says something significant about, or at least it gives us some hints about why things might come to be frozen middle forms or media tantum forms. Okay, so motivations for developing media tantum verbs: the frequency of human-related situations, whether they're states, experiences, or processes, I think it goes back to Lyon's conception of the middle. These are ones that affect the human subject of the verb or his or her interests. The preponderance of things that relate to human beings, and probably how frequently those are used at some earlier stage of the language, and then they get frozen into that form and you drop out the transitive, causative, separation of entity kind of semantic meaning. So, and also we see here the frequency of such situations that are non-dynamic, because you cannot combine this, what looks like this old middle ending, with progressive, causative, instrument applicative, antipassive, and so on. All of these have more dynamic semantics in them, whereas the middle ending typically is less dynamic, it's more static. So you perhaps have a combination of semantic things, and I'm guessing also frequency, but we don't actually have the frequency of use kind of data for earlier stages of the language. You know, modern corpora don't show us that, and we don't have any old corpora from, 100 years ago. Okay, I think we have a few minutes to address, maybe I'll just wave my hands at some of this irregularity business, and I have a number of slides here that we probably don't have time to go through very well, but I'll just maybe point out one irregular verb. So we have airaga, which means to obscure or hide something behind something else. It behaves morphologically as a media tantum verb and drops that final when core affixes are added. So a gata to the house obstructs the goat from view is the transitive form, and a garita, he or she is obstructing it. We put the progressive ending on there and you drop this ending, but otherwise you cannot drop that ending from this verb. It can have a dynamic reciprocal or reflexive sense, just like other productive oppositional middles. So he or she hid himself, where there's no object marked in this clause, and it's understood that it applies to oneself. So the semantics are those of a middle. But you notice this tone difference here between the transitive version, which is actually non-progressive in its meaning and its form, versus this tone here corresponds to what would be the perfect perfective form. I won't go into all those details, but it's kind of funny. The normal perfective or perfect middle ending should be not a. And you don't find that sort of ending here. So it's like, what's going on here? This looks like a perfective verb, and yet it has reciprocal semantics or reflexive semantics. It behaves like a media tantum. So if we add various affixes, we saw the progressive before, but if you put on the instrumental, that disappears. We find that often the transitive subjects of this verb are inanimate, potentially correlating with a less dynamic profile. So it looks like, this is something I've already said about the tone difference here. It looks like the source maybe was a regular active transitive verb, and it's only partially been assimilated into the media tantum group because the perfective perfect form doesn't have the normal ending. Okay, so it's kind of half and half in its properties. I'll skip this. Well, okay, let me talk about this. Perhaps another kind of a route to a media tantum. We find asinya to be wholly perfect, spotless. It occurs only in the non-perfect aspect. The final again does not alternate with the perfective middle okay? So here's an example. It is an ox which has no physical fault, that is perfect, that is holy, that is slaughtered for different ceremonies. We find a semantically related noun adjective form, signati, holy or blameless, signat. It has all the morphology that you would expect of nouns and adjectives. Well, it sure looks like it's got the same kind of root in there somewhere. Perhaps this one here, osinya, came from a noun source or an adjective source. But as a verb, it behaves like one of these funny media tantum verbs. So you put on, you can put on another middle looking ending on here, the ventive middle here, or you can put on the class 1 causative and it drops that ending. So do some of them come from old transitive verbs where we lost the transitive version? Do some of them come from noun or adjective sources? They all end up looking partly like these media tantum verbs. Okay, so to conclude briefly here, I would say that Ma has a middle with media tantum verbs, potentially typologically unusual because of how that middle ending can sometimes disappear. And linguistic categories have permeable boundaries. So these classifications like dynamic transitive verb, media tantum verb, and so on, they leak around the edges because of historical reasons, because of the creativity of human use and how we press words and forms into new uses all the time. And I'll stop there.
Well, we have time probably for one, maybe two questions, so fire away quickly.
Thank you for your talk. I had one question. When you gave your core affixes, I was thinking, oh, the progressive one doesn't seem to fit so nicely as the others. Could be classified as a type of balancing changing, where we usually think of the progressive as like an inflectional affix, you know. So I thought that one stands out. Maybe using the term core was fine, but I wondered then when you started talking about these middles as being more stative-like, well, you know, the progressive is something that we don't normally find on states. Do you have any further comment on what? Yep.
Right.
Progressive as opposed to the other rest of the set of your core affixes.
Yeah. So aspect is a really old component, I think, in nilotic. They don't all, not all the languages have tense. Ma does not have tense, but aspect goes way back. So I think that the perfect, the perfective, the progressive, and so on, they're really down in the center of the verb in a way. And then you get other stuff like the impersonal, the antipassive, and so on, and other kinds of clitic kinds of things on the outside. So it's old, for one thing. I do think that there tends to be a semantic clash. Now, you can say, I am hitting myself. You can get a progressive with that reflexive kind of meaning, but you've got to use a periphrastic progressive form, and you have to stick it in. I don't know, auxiliary. You can't use that morphological one. So I'll stop there. Somebody else say something. Sorry. I don't know whether you want to call it inflectional or derivational. That's another issue. Sorry.
Okay, I have one other quick question since nobody else has asked one. In field method system, students are going to be looking at Luo, which is also a nilotic language, only it's Western. Any idea if this is typologically, have you looked at any other nilotic languages? Is this a feature of other Eastern nilotic languages?
Yes. So it's not clear that what has been called a middle in some other nilotic sub-branches is cognate with this ending. I think there's important historical work to be done. There is a middle, there has been claimed to be a middle form, perhaps in Luo, and I think if you look at Kemmer's book on the middle voice, somewhere kind of 2/3 of the way through the book, she does talk, I believe, about the Luo case. If not Luo, it's another Western nilotic. But I don't recall that the ending looks like, or the verb form looks like this one. In Longo, which is Western nilotic grammar written by Mickey Noonan, he has tried to take understand all the verb forms, and he talks in quite different terminology about classes of verbs and alternations, but some of them end in an a or o form. So you might look at that.
And it's Rachel Aubrey wrote, but accidentally to me instead of to everyone, I'm forwarded. Media tantum verbs change diachronically in ancient Greek and other languages that have middles as well. And what you find in Ma is what we would expect to find in a language with a middle system. Verbs in Greek historically change their middle and active endings as well. And sometimes we get mixed forms. So, or, you know, in Greek, some verbs are middle only in the imperfective and not middle in the perfective aspect. And so it all gets messy. But anyway, thank you so much. Dr. Payne, Doris Payne,
Okay.
for sharing with us. This was fascinating. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And unfortunately, we all now have to get out of the room here physically, very quickly, so that the following class can set up. So thank you all. Our
Okay.
next academic forum is in 2 weeks. So
Right.
look for announcements in the normal places.